The Venator Star Destroyer is one of the most awesome ships from the prequel trilogy. In many ways, it's one of the most balanced capital ships in Star Wars history because it was a perfect blend between starship carrier and offensive command post. Estimates suggest that the Republic may have had up to 10,000 of these warships during the Clone Wars. One question some fans may have is why couldn't the Rebels use old Venators against the Empire, considering that they had Old Republic Y-Wing and also several of the Old Republic vehicles like ATTEs and ATRTs at their disposal. In this video, I'm going to look at 6 different reasons to explain in detail why this was never feasible. Let's get started. The first and most obvious reason why the Rebels couldn't really use Venators against the Empire was that they never really had the option. Palpatine's new government effectively absorbed the Grand Army of the Republic after the end of the Clone Wars. Let's set the scene for what happened after the war ended. We know that the Sith Lord Darth Sidious manipulated the entire galaxy into conflict in his devious scheme to destroy the Jedi. One of the first steps he took after turning Anakin Skywalker to the dark side was to order him to deactivate the Separatist droid army. The new Sith apprentice, Darth Vader, applied the necessary codes, and almost all the battle droids across the galaxy went to sleep. There were some exceptions, including the super tactical droid General Kalani, as we see in Star Wars Rebels. But the reality was that the Empire appeared to rise like a phoenix, promising much-needed stability after years of war and devastation. Meanwhile, the Empire retained the services of its clone troopers, as we see throughout the Bad Batch. Many units retained the same designations and commanders, including the 501st Legion and the Wolf Pack. However, their accelerated aging meant that most clones left the service between 10 and 5 BBY. There's no official cutoff date, but this time frame makes sense because clones age at twice the rate of normal humans. Gradually, the Empire replaced its clones with regular human stormtrooper recruits and reshaped its military forces as they shifted to system suppression instead of open warfare. They replaced ATTE walkers with AT-ATs because of the latter's intimidating appearance, even though the Clone Wars era platform was more effective in open war zones. It was a similar story with the Old Republic Navy. The Venator-class Star Destroyer first entered service in 22 BBY around the time of the First Battle of Geonosis. It replaced the Acclamator as the Republic's main capital ship and was the first true Star Destroyer. Ultimate Star Wars says that Quat Drive Yards were the first producers of these ships, although they outsourced them to other shipyards, including the Corellian and Santh shipyards. Incidentally, Quat Drive Yards and their subsidiaries would construct all subsequent Star Destroyers in canon, including the First Order's Resurgent and Zeiston classes. The Venators served the Republic with distinction throughout the Clone Wars, with many Jedi Generals using them as their command ships, including Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind. Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs, but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. This early Star Destroyer was extremely effective against the Separatist Lucrehulk-class battleships and other frontline vessels like the Munificent-class Star Frigate or Providence-class Star Dreadnought. We know from the Revenge of the Sith Incredible Cross-Sections visual guide that the second-generation Venator 2 had a powerful armament of 8 heavy turbo laser turrets and a single medium turbo laser turret. These vast ships had an unprecedented starfighter capacity in their hangar bays. Some Venators could hold up to 100 ships depending on their loadout. This changed space warfare because previous conflicts in canon and legends primarily saw capital ships go head-to-head. Of course, this still happened in the Clone Wars, but starfighter squadrons played a crucial and often devastating role. However, we should remember that the Republic fleet was already going through a transition before the Empire arose in 19 BBY. Despite this, we know for certain that Venators remained in Imperial service during the early days of the Empire. Catalyst, a Rogue One novel, reveals that Emperor Palpatine used one to travel to Geonosis to witness the early stages of the first Death Star's construction. Meanwhile, Darth Vader also used an unnamed Venator Star Destroyer as his flagship before replacing it with the Imperial Star Destroyer Perilous. The 2017 Darth Vader comic book series shows that it carried Vader's personal meditation chamber. A trio of Venator Star Destroyers obliterated Tapoka City and the Kaminoan cloning facilities in the Bad Batch series. It's worth noting that all these Imperial-era Venators had the Empire's distinctive gray livery instead of the Republic's deep red. This gave them a more foreboding appearance, although we'll talk more about the importance of symbolism later in this video. However, there were several reasons why the Venator gradually left Imperial service. Firstly, there were limitations to its design that made it unsuitable for the new Imperial era. Kuat Drive Yards was already beginning to introduce Victory-class Star Destroyers before the end of the Clone Wars. Gradually, these ships and the later Imperial class superseded the Venator. One of the main reasons for this was the evolution of Imperial military strategy. They followed the Tarkin doctrine, which advocated using fear and intimidation to oppress potential resistance into submission. I already mentioned the AT-AT Walker, which was a shining example of the Tarkin doctrine in production. The Victory and Imperial-class Star Destroyers have far more firepower than the earlier Venators, even if they're arguably less balanced in their overall designs. Another issue is that too many people knew Venators as Jedi cruisers. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire explains that Palpatine didn't want to use ships associated with a hated enemy. Their name wasn't intimidating enough for his requirements either. The 2018 Thrawn comic book series shows that there were still a few Venators in service during the Galactic Civil War, however, these were few and far between across the galaxy. If we go back to the original topic of the galaxy, it's clear that there simply weren't many usable Venators available, even if the Rebels wanted to steal them from the Empire. Jedi Fallen Order reveals that the Empire began decommissioning many Venators as early as 19 BBY on scrapyard planets, including Braca. This was the location of a major campaign during the Clone Wars. The salvage materials went into newer Imperial machinery and ships. According to Star Wars: The Rebel Files, the Venator was still in production as late as 5 BBY, but this would have been on a very limited scale. To sum up, there were very few functional Venators remaining by the time of the Galactic Civil War, and they were all in Imperial service. Okay, so we've established that it was almost impossible for the Rebels to get their hands on a fully functional Venator Star Destroyer. But let's imagine an alternative reality where they somehow did obtain one of these powerful capital ships. This might seem like it would instantly provide them with massive firepower, but there's one big problem. It's unlikely that they would have been able to fulfill this ship's crew requirements. The sourcebook Rise of the Separatists says that Venators had a full crew complement of 7,400. They could also carry up to 2,000 troops. Of course, this is nowhere near the size of later generation Star Destroyers, but it's still a massive capacity. And this is where the issue begins, because it would have been nearly impossible for the early Rebel Alliance to meet them. We know from the Andor series that the Rebels operated on an extremely secretive basis in tiny cells. Even if they had the numbers available, it's not as simple as just putting people inside a ship. They need the training to understand the ship's sensitive systems. Each area of the ship would require different specialists, from engineers and mechanics to gunners and security staff. But that's only the onboard crew, because they also need reserves for when active crew members suffer injuries and illnesses or simply go on leave. Meanwhile, they're not going to develop these skills just magically. A capital ship's crew requires intense specialized training, which usually takes place at a centralized location. The Imperial Naval Academy is a prime example in canon and legends. Previously known as the Prefspelt Academy during the Clone Wars, it had many illustrious and notorious alumni. They included Biggs Darklighter, Hobby Kilivian, Grand Moff Tarkin, and Admiral Ray Sloane. The Rebel Alliance welcomed defectors, with many finding themselves in positions of power after proving their loyalty. General Crix Medine is a prime example because he even led an Imperial commando unit before joining the rebellion. However, the Ultimate Star Wars also reveals that he specialized in covert warfare, which also suited the Rebels because it was compatible with their meager resources and went under the radar. The Rebels didn't have constant access to educational institutions to develop their own navy. In the Legends X-Wing series, Booster Tarek got his hands on an Imperial Star Destroyer, the Errant Venture. Yes, General Aaron Kraken forced him to strip it of most of its weaponry, But even still, we regularly read how boosters struggled to meet the ship's complement. Anyone who's read the X-Wing series will know how Michael A. Stackpole brilliantly presented the lives of Rebel pilots and the New Republic Navy. This depiction of the errant venture is a very realistic representation of how obtaining a Star Destroyer may seem like a great idea on paper, but it's not so easy to actually do something with it. Another issue is that even Star Destroyers require escort ships. The Republic typically used them in pairs alongside several Acclamator-class cruisers and other smaller ships, as we see during the Clone Wars series. This occurred at Christophsis, Ryloth, and many other engagements. They protected each other and packed more of a punch. However, even a small strike force required thousands of crew members. It simply wasn't sustainable for the Rebel Alliance to consider, even in the beginning. Also, don't forget they'd have gone to all that effort for what were essentially outdated ships. A Venator is unlikely to beat an Imperial Star Destroyer in a head-to-head engagement. The Rogue One visual guide reveals that a standard M-Star Deuce had 60 turbo laser batteries, 8 octuple turbo laser batteries, and 60 ion cannon emplacements. Venators had a larger hangar bay capacity, but that was their only advantage. A couple of anti-starfighter Lancer-class frigates on the Imperial side would quickly balance that out. I can already hear some of you asking, what about the Mon Calamari cruisers? There are a few reasons why the Rebels were able to use these gigantic ships effectively. Firstly, the Mon Calamari shipyards were the only major ship production site under Rebel control. There isn't much about them in canon, but Legends develops them further. The Empire enslaved the planet and its people, including Admiral Akbar. According to the sourcebook Geonosis and the Outer Rim Worlds, the Imperials attempted to assimilate Mon Cala technology but failed. Then Lorinar Corporation took control of the shipyards to produce strike-class cruisers for the Imperial Navy. However, persistent Mon Calamari and Quarren sabotage efforts delayed the project. The Essential Guide to Warfare explains that Grand Moff Tarkin was a big admirer of their luxury starliners. In a major miscalculation, which shows how much he underestimated the planet's inhabitants, he allowed their shipwrights to continue building them. They repaid him by covertly converting them into combat-capable starships. Perhaps this may seem overly naive on Tarkin's part, but we should give the Mon Calamari credit. In Book 2 of Timothy Zahn's iconic Thrawn trilogy, Dark Force Rising, Princess Leia notes that the Mon Calamari were never a warlike species until the Empire enslaved them. The Mon Calamari and Quarren overthrew their Imperial oppressors in one BBY and openly joined the rebellion. By the time of the Battle of Endor and Return of the Jedi, they had produced dozens of ships, including 8 new heavy cruisers. Crucially, as we see in Episode 6, it was primarily Mon Calamari who crewed these ships. Their bridges were ergonomically designed for their individual needs, although this would evolve with the dawn of the New Republic. Suddenly, the rebellion had access to a trained talent pool that was large enough to sustain a fleet of advanced ships. It was perfect timing that would never have been possible if they stole or cobbled together an old Venator. The Mon Calamari already had the infrastructure and support networks in place, as well as local specialists who had a unique expertise. Crucially, even if the Imperials captured a Mon Calamari cruiser, they would struggle to adapt it for their needs. They were the ideal ship at the right time for the Rebel Alliance. The third key reason why the Rebels didn't use Venators or other older capital ships against the Empire was that it didn't fit within their military doctrine. We know from what we've already discussed that this was partially circumstantial. Realistically, if they had the means to go head-to-head with the Empire in standard fleet warfare, they probably would have. However, the Rebels' need for secrecy, combined with the might of the Imperial war machine, meant that they had to adapt to their shortcomings. The Imperials consistently underestimated them, so they were often able to turn their shortcomings into advantages. It is important to note that this usually came at a high cost, but the Rebels were willing to pay the ultimate price if it meant saving the galaxy from endless tyranny. We see this during the first and second Death Star runs and throughout the Andor series. The first Death Star run is a fascinating case study because the Empire completely disregarded the Rebel threat at Yavin. According to the canon guide Starships and Speeders, the DS-1 could hold a total capacity of 7,000 starfighters. Now, it's true that it takes time to mobilize all these ships, and it may not have been carrying a full complement, but they should have released far more than they did against Gold and Red squadrons. However, Grand Moff Tarkin arrogantly believed that the battle station was invincible. The Rogue One movie reveals how Galen Erso sabotaged the design by secretly including a critical flaw that could destroy the entire Death Star. This never even crossed the minds of Tarkin or Director Krennic, who oversaw the project. Starfighters played a crucial role in taking down the second Death Star too. They flew so close to the battle station and even weaved through its unfinished structure, so it was extremely difficult for Imperial forces to destroy them without damaging the Death Star. Meanwhile, during the same battle, a single A-Wing took out the Executor on a kamikaze run into its bridge. One pilot's noble sacrifice eliminated the biggest ship in the Imperial fleet. Starships and Speeders reveals that it had a crew of over 280,000 who lost their lives in the blink of an eye. Remember, this was Darth Vader's flagship too, so you can bet that the Empire's best and brightest were on board. A single starfighter inflicted a devastating blow on the Imperial fleet. Starfighter squadrons played a critical role in Rebel strategies because there are several examples of them being multi-purpose units. Both Rogue Squadron and Wraith Squadron worked alongside Lieutenant Page's commandos and went undercover in Michael A. Stackpole's X-Wing series. It was also easier for the Rebels to hide their ships on bases like Yavin 4 when they were running from the Empire. Meanwhile, their limited talent pool meant it made sense to put their most skilled pilots in starfighters instead of wasting them on capital ships that were inferior to their Imperial counterparts. The Rebels also constantly innovated and upgraded their starfighters. They obtained next-generation A-Wings and B-Wings throughout the war, replacing the old, slow Y-Wings. Meanwhile, we know that they consistently upgraded their astromech droid core so that their starfighters had every advantage possible in battle. Finally, their ships had shields as standard, which was a massive difference from regular Imperial TIE fighters. This was an extremely different military doctrine from the Empire. In Rebels, the pragmatic Grand Admiral Thrawn fought to get the TIE Defender project off the ground because most Imperials thought it was a waste of time. Rebel leaders knew they had limited resources, so they valued their pilots and sought to maximize their potential. It's likely that even if they had access to fully functional Venator Star Destroyers, they would mainly use them as mobile fleet carriers instead of risking them in battle. The next reason why the Rebels couldn't use Venators against the Empire is a hugely significant one. It would have been impossible for the Rebels to maintain these massive ships to be able to use them efficiently. Firstly, the Empire had full control over the major shipyards that built Venators, including Kuat Drive Yards and Corellia. There was almost nowhere where the Rebels could bring Venators into dry dock or repair or upgrade these ships. This would have been true even if they had fully functional Venators straight off the assembly line. However, as we've well established by now, there were very few in operation during the Galactic Civil War. This means they likely would have salvaged older Venators that were probably missing critical components. These ships would require a total overhaul to be spaceworthy and safe for their crews to fly. I believe that it would very quickly become a liability instead of an asset. I've already mentioned the errant venture and how Booster Tarek struggled to keep it running with a bare-bones crew. Timothy Zahn's Hand of Thrawn duology explains that Tarek hired 200 Verpine technicians to refit the ship and upgrade its systems over 7 months. Remember, this was more about improving and restoring a deteriorating ship rather than turning it into a top-tier warship. The Rebels likely wouldn't have had the luxury of time or the resources to retrofit a Venator before the Empire intervened. It was a different story with the Mon Calamari star cruisers because they already had the infrastructure in place to refit their ships according to their own designs. Even if the Rebels somehow sourced a Venator, they would still have needed the appropriate engineers, mechanics, and weapon technicians to do the job. This is nowhere near as simple as it sounds. The Millennium Falcon is another great example of how much effort it takes to maintain an aging starship. It's a running joke throughout the series with both Han and Chewie constantly performing repairs and essentially keeping the ship together with duct tape. In Episode 5, the hyperdrive completely fails, and this forces them to hide in an asteroid field as the Empire actively hunts them. The hyperdrive problem rises its head again in The Rise of Skywalker when the systems overload and nearly tear the ship apart. In Episode 7, the engines stall, so Rey and Finn almost crash the old freighter into Jakku. And don't get me started on the hyperdrive motivator. Now imagine all this on a larger scale with a barely functioning Venator Star Destroyer. Rebel leaders couldn't risk putting so many lives at stake by putting them in an unreliable ship. There are so many different ways that it could be catastrophic, so they'd never take this chance. The Rebels did make many sacrifices, but they only did it when the result was worthwhile. For example, in Rogue One, Cassian Andor and his entire covert unit lose their lives to secure the Death Star plans. This is obviously for the greater good, so it's a reasonable price to pay. but just getting on board a dysfunctional ship isn't the greatest idea in the galaxy. We saw in The Mandalorian that it is possible to upgrade an old starfighter and completely rebuild it. After the destruction of the Razor Crest, Din Djarin obtained a hot rod rebuild of an old Naboo N1 starfighter. There's no denying that it looks awesome and really plays on the nostalgia factor, but it also needs constant maintenance, and this is on such a small scale. It would be nearly impossible to do the same with an old Venator because it would have been so expensive. Rise of the Separatists says that a brand new Venator cost 59 million credits to construct. The Rebels would have had to spend much more to keep it in space. Then there are the additional costs like fuel and armaments. Star Wars Complete Vehicles says that a Venator's main reactor could burn 40,000 tons of fuel per second at full burn. There are certain aspects of Star Wars that stretch the boundary of realism, like every planet having breathable atmospheres and ships having Earth-standard gravity. But the cost of fuel is something that transcends every universe, fictional or real. The fifth major reason why the Rebels couldn't use old Venators against the Empire is that they were too detectable. Don't forget that the Rebels avoided direct confrontations with the Imperial fleet unless it was absolutely unavoidable. The Battle of Endor was one of the main exceptions to the rule because they believed they finally had enough capital ships to take out the unprotected Death Star. When they realized it was a trap, they held the line and continued to fight. However, even this was just a distraction tactic to buy their elite strike team time to take down the shield generator on Endor. Usually, the Rebels attempted to undermine Imperial institutions from within instead of picking fights they'd almost certainly lose. There's nowhere that the Rebels could have kept a Venator without arousing suspicion. The Ultimate Star Wars book says that they were about 1,155 meters in length and 548 meters wide. Meanwhile, the Emperor had spies across the entire galaxy, even on backwater planets like Tatooine, as we saw in Episode 4. Avoiding detection would have been unfeasible, so the Rebels would never have been able to use these massive ships. It's a very different story with the Mon Calamari cruisers. As I've already explained, the Empire didn't realize that the locals were refitting their luxury liners until it was too late. That's the big difference between the likes of Home 1 and a Venator, which is obviously a frontline capital ship. The Rebels went to extreme lengths to escape detection from the Empire. In Episodes 4 and 5, we see how they designed their bases to be temporary. They abandoned Yavin 4 directly after the Death Star attack, while they rapidly evacuated Hoth after the Imperial fleet entered the system. Admittedly, there was an element of luck there because the clumsy Admiral Ozzel gave them away. Nonetheless, the nature of these planets shows how much effort they went to avoid Imperial oversight. Hoth in particular is one of the most inhospitable planets in the galaxy. This icy world was home to ferocious wampas and sub-zero territories with no population centers. The Rebels survived by accepting that sometimes they had to abandon years of work overnight. They left equipment behind, only taking care to wipe data before making their escape. As well as Yavin 4 and Hoth, we know they had bases on Lothal, Dantooine, and Atollon. The radical partisan rebels Saw Gerrera also operated from many isolated secret locations, including Onderon and Jeddah, that he would instantly leave at the prospect of detection. Having a Venator in orbit would have been lighting the Batlight. Also, most rebel cells didn't know about each other's existence. We see in Andor that Luthen Rael gives Cassian information on a need-to-know basis because this reduces the damage from interrogation or defection. They would even make harsh sacrifices if it was necessary to keep the rest of the rebel strategy safe. One of the most emotional scenes in Andor saw Clea Markey assist in Luthen's death after he was exposed as Axis. First, he tried to kill himself to escape interrogation, but the Empire kept him on life support. Clea infiltrated the hospital and successfully disconnected him from the system, knowing it would end his life. It's all the more impactful because we know Luthen raised Clea from a young age. However, it's what Luthen would have wanted because he even ruthlessly dispatched allies like Lonnie to escape detection. As he said in his iconic soliloquy, "I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see." These powerful words reveal the extent to which Luthen went to fuel the rebellion, but it was a nightmarish existence. Plausible deniability was another key element of the rebel strategy. For example, the Empire knew that Bail Organa and his planet Alderaan were sympathizers, if not outright collaborators. However, Alderaan's wealth, power, and influence as a core world protected it until the creation of the first Death Star. It was a similar situation for Mon Mothma and her homeworld of Chandrila, as they were constantly looking over their shoulders with the Empire, even replacing her driver with one of their agents. Although the Empire committed many atrocities, including the Gorman massacres, they carefully framed them as responses to rebel dissident activity. If the rebels parked a Venator Star Destroyer above a world, they would instantly invite an Imperial response. Plausible deniability would instantly go out the window. They would be giving the Empire an excuse to devastate the planet below and to purge its leaders. Even Emperor Palpatine recognized the importance of playing the game and maintaining the veneer of pretending to care about his subjects. In Attack of the Clones, he even makes a point of observing how powerful politics can be after Padme Amidala led a successful vote against him and thwarted his plans. However, they were unbelievably cruel when they had a reason. Grand Moff Tarkin ordered the total destruction of Alderaan just to make a point to Princess Leia because it was her homeworld. This was unbelievably sick and psychopathic behavior from a former ranking officer of the Republic, but it wasn't even the first time he ordered mass genocide. By the time the rebels could use a Venator, they would have already won the war. The final reason why the rebels couldn't use old Venators against the Empire goes back to the reality that there weren't many left in the galaxy. I've already discussed the Tarkin doctrine and how the Imperial Navy essentially recalibrated its fleet to focus on heavy firepower and intimidation with the likes of the Victory and especially the Imperial-class Star Destroyers. The Executor-class Star Destroyer was the most extreme example of this in the Imperial fleet because everything about it was intended to terrify. The old Venators were great battleships, but it's fair to say that they lack the same terrifying aura as the later Imperial models. A good reason for this is that we're used to seeing them with Republic red livery throughout the Clone Wars. Then there's the fact that many galactic citizens knew these ships simply as Jedi cruisers. That's a big part of why the Empire tried to replace them as quickly as possible. They were trying to purge the Jedi and suppress every mention of the Order across the galaxy. This would be more difficult if they reminded everybody of the Jedi's existence by using their old ships. From a sheer political perspective, it didn't make sense to use Venators. The Jedi were the generals defending the Republic from galactic tyranny. We had one man's word that the entire Order was suddenly traitors and plotting to take control of the Republic. Palpatine himself knew that his rule was pretty tenuous unless he dominated the narrative. Even the Venator's name or profile isn't quite in alignment with the Empire's message. Firstly, in the real world, Venator is Latin for hunter. This reflects the ship's role as an aggressive, forward-operating battleship that deployed starships against the CIS droid fleets. This is very different from the intimidating nature of the Imperial or Executor-class Star Destroyers, which exude domination and overwhelming force. Meanwhile, while the Venator does have that distinctive Star Destroyer wedge shape, it's not quite as dagger-like as the later models. No Star Wars fan will ever forget the first time they watched the opening scene of Episode 4 when the Devastator rolled across the screen. Even the names of the individual ships are so different. Anakin Skywalker's main flagship during the Clone Wars was the Resolute. Obi-Wan Kenobi typically operated from the Negotiator. This is very different from the names that appear in the Imperial fleet in canon and legends. Grand Admiral Thrawn commanded the Chimera, while other notable ships included the Relentless, the Avenger, and of course, the Executor. These names were extremely intentional because they were so terrifying. The Empire was happy to replace the Venators because of the optics involved. Interestingly, in Legends, the Republic captured and reused several Star Destroyers at various points. Although they retained the overall class name, they usually renamed the individual ship in moral contrast with the Empire, like the Liberator or the Emancipator, as we see in the X-Wing series. Symbolism is massively important in Star Wars, so let's finish by asking the question of whether the Rebel Alliance would have chosen to use Venators against the Empire if they had all the necessary support networks and infrastructure in place. It's tempting to say yes because they were symbols of the Old Republic and a reminder of what the galaxy took away. On a practical level, they were also extremely effective warships and may have been the perfect platform to release Rebel starfighter squadrons. It's certainly easy to imagine Wedge Antilles and Rogue Squadron using a Venator as a mobile center of operations. However, Venators were also a reminder of the Republic and Jedi's descent into militarization, as well as the beginning of humanity's galactic domination. A huge reason behind the success of the Rebel Alliance was that it was a multi-species operation. From Bothan spies and Mon Calamari cruisers to Solistani pilots, and the dozens of other beings who liberated the galaxy from Imperial tyranny.
Oh, and again, for a limited time, every Stickman Saber purchase comes with 2 additional combat sabers, so you're more than ready for your own duels. If that sounds like something you'd want to look into, the link's in the description.